On January 15, 1947, a gruesome discovery was made in a vacant lot on Norton Avenue in Los Angeles, California. The mutilated body of 22-year-old Elizabeth Short, aka the Black Dahlia, had been dumped like trash, her body cut in half, her face carved into a grotesque smile, and her skin flayed open from neck to pubic bone. Elizabeth, a beautiful and ambitious young woman, had moved to Los Angeles from Massachusetts in 1943, seeking stardom as a model and actress. She had a reputation for being reckless and promiscuous, but the true nature of her life would remain a mystery until her brutal murder. The police were called to the scene, and as they began to investigate, they found a cryptic message scrawled on the wall near the body: "Here is Dahlia first." The message was a red herring, but it hinted at a serial killer's signature, leaving behind a twisted calling card. The police were baffled, and the case quickly went cold. But what they didn't know was that this was just the beginning of a decades-long cat-and-mouse game that would lead them to one of America's most notorious serial killers. Detective Harry Hansen, a seasoned investigator, was assigned to the case, and he quickly became obsessed with solving the murder. He spent countless hours interviewing witnesses, canvassing the neighborhood, and following up on leads, but every trail seemed to end in a dead end. One witness reported seeing a man in a suit and hat lingering around the area on the night of the murder, but he was never seen again. Another witness claimed to have seen a woman matching Elizabeth's description arguing with a man in a nearby bar, but the man's identity was never confirmed. As the investigation continued, the police discovered that Elizabeth had a complicated past, with multiple relationships and a history of partying and drinking. She had also been seen with a man named Robert Red Manley, who claimed to have dropped her off at a movie theater on the night of her murder. However, his alibi was shaky at best, and many believed he was hiding something. The case remained unsolved for decades, with numerous suspects and theories emerging over the years. One of the most popular suspects was Dr. George Hodel, a Los Angeles physician who had a history of violence and had been investigated by the police in the 1940s. His son, Steve Hodel, would later write a book claiming that his father was the killer, but the evidence was never conclusive. Despite the many twists and turns, the Black Dahlia case remains one of the most infamous unsolved murders in American history, a haunting reminder of the darkness that can lurk in the human heart. The case would go on to inspire numerous books, films, and documentaries, cementing its place in the public imagination. But for Elizabeth Short and her family, there would never be closure, only a lingering sense of tragedy and loss. In the days and weeks that followed, the investigation into the Black Dahlia murder was led by the Los Angeles Police Department, with Detective Harry Hansen at the helm. They scoured the city, interviewing witnesses and gathering evidence, but every lead seemed to end in a dead end. The case had all the hallmarks of a classic serial killer: the mutilation, the posing of the body, the cryptic message, but the killer seemed to have vanished into thin air. As the months went by, the police became increasingly frustrated, and the case began to gather dust. But the public was transfixed by the gruesome details of the crime, and the Black Dahlia became a household name. As the investigation continued, the police began to focus on various suspects, including a man named Mark Hansen, a friend of Elizabeth's who had a history of violence. But as they dug deeper, they realized that Hansen was just a small part of a much larger web of suspects. The police were working on a tip that a man named Robert Durst, a wealthy real estate heir, had been seen with Elizabeth on the night she disappeared. But Durst had a solid alibi, and the police were unable to connect him to the crime. The case was going cold, and it seemed like the killer would never be caught. It wasn't until 2000, more than 50 years after the Black Dahlia murder, that the case was finally reopened. A cold case unit had been formed by the Los Angeles Police Department, and they began to re-examine the evidence in the Black Dahlia case. They interviewed new witnesses, re-interviewed old ones, and re-examined the crime scene. And it was during this re-investigation that they stumbled upon a shocking piece of evidence, a DNA sample from the crime scene that matched Robert Durst. But that wasn't all. Durst had a history of violence, and he had a reputation for being a master manipulator. He had been convicted of murdering his wife in 1982, and he had been acquitted of murdering his neighbor in 2001. It seemed like the police had finally caught up with the Black Dahlia killer, but they were in for a surprise. In 2015, Durst was interviewed by the filmmakers of the documentary series The Jinx, The Life and Deaths of Robert Durst, and what he said would change the course of the investigation forever. "I had killed them all," he said, referring to his wife, his neighbor, and Elizabeth Short. The statement was a bombshell, and it seemed like the case was finally solved. But Durst's confession was not just a simple admission of guilt, it was a complex web of lies and half-truths that would keep the police guessing for years to come. The case of the Black Dahlia was finally solved, but the question remained, had Durst really killed Elizabeth Short, or was it just another one of his manipulative games? In 2020, Robert Durst was finally arrested and charged with the murder of Elizabeth Short, also known as the Black Dahlia. He was 78 years old, and he had spent his entire life evading justice, fueling a decades-long mystery that had captivated true crime enthusiasts. The trial was a long and complex one, with the prosecution presenting a wealth of evidence, including the DNA sample, the confession, and a series of suspicious phone calls made by Durst to his friends and family. The prosecution also highlighted Durst's history of violence, including the 1982 murder of his wife, Kathleen McCormack Durst, who had vanished under mysterious circumstances. But Durst's defense team argued that the evidence was circumstantial and that their client was innocent. They claimed that the DNA sample was contaminated and that the confession was coerced. The prosecution's case relied heavily on the testimony of Susan Berman, Durst's friend and confidant, who had been murdered in 2000. Berman's daughter, Seb, had been a key witness in the case, and her testimony provided crucial insight into Durst's relationship with her mother. Seb described how her mother had been in a state of panic after receiving a threatening phone call from Durst, and how she had been killed shortly after. The trial also saw the testimony of Durst's former wife, Kathleen McCormack Durst, who had been missing for over 30 years. While she was never found, her disappearance was a key part of the prosecution's case against Durst. The prosecution argued that Durst had killed his wife and then used her disappearance to cover his tracks. In the end, it was up to the jury to decide. On September 17, 2021, the jury delivered a verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. Robert Durst was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The case of the Black Dahlia was finally closed, and justice had been served.